So the last time we spoke together was in early May last year, which, just as a reminder for listeners, was a pretty difficult time for Ukraine because it was struggling with lack of ammunition and equipment because of delays with US aid. 8 months later from then today, if we look at how the situation has changed, what is your sort of overall high level view of how the war developed over that time? And how is it going for both sides today?
Well, two or three things about last year. You correctly highlighted or reminded everyone that the U.S. Because of our own internal problems, failed to deliver aid to Ukraine for many months, and that showed up at in the battlefield with Ukraine having difficulty encountering Russia's artillery advantage. For example, as somebody told me, they said, the Ukrainians lost Avdiivka not because they didn't have enough drones, but because they didn't have enough artillery ammunition, and that's a fact. But eventually, we got past that, and things started flowing again. European countries, at least some, continued to provide what they could, despite our uh, pause of several months. Um, and Russia was not able to exploit this. I mean, if you think about it, uh, Avdiivka. I was in Munich February last year at the Munich Security Conference when Avdiivka collapsed or was taken by the Russians after many months and lots of casualties. And people were walking around, oh my God, Avdiivka has fallen. Like, well, have you ever looked at a map? I mean, Avdiivka is so far in the east of Ukraine, and here, 11 months later, the Russians have still not captured Pokrovsk, which is only 65 kilometers from Avdiivka, despite hundreds of thousands of casualties. So, my point is that the Russians clearly do not have the capability to knock Ukraine out of the war. They don't have the strong mobile forces that could break through, exploit these tactical victories and then drive 60, 70 kilometers deeper into the Ukrainian rear area. It doesn't exist. Instead, we're all watching videos of golf carts and pickup trucks carrying unlucky Russian and North Korean infantry in the attack. That's the best that the Russians can do. In the meanwhile, Ukraine, the general staff sees what's happening in the east, that Russia cannot exploit that, so they decide to take operational risk and build up forces for this counteroffensive, which they launched in August in the direction of Kursk. And they're still there 6 months later, which has created strategic dilemma for the Kremlin as well as operational and tactical problems for the Kremlin. And despite Russian efforts, that thing is still there, not as big as it was, but it's still there. And then finally, um, the I think Putin is in a much weaker position now than he was a year ago. When you consider not only the casualties and the lost equipment and the resilience of Ukrainian defenders, uh, but when I saw the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, that Russia could not stop that Russia did not have the capability to save their ally Assad, and now they've lost their navy base, Tartus. They're losing their air bases in Syria. What a what a failure and a not just embarrassing, but loss of important strategic foothold in the Middle East for Russia because they didn't have enough to do that and keep fighting Ukraine. So that's a little bit longer. I apologize, but there are a lot of different indicators, and when you read headlines, oh, the Russians have momentum, they're advancing. No, no, they're not. 3,600 square kilometers. That sounds like a lot. That means that's a box that's 60 kilometers by 60 kilometers. For your English audience, that's 35 miles by 35 miles. That's it after a year.
What's your view regarding the Kursk offensive on the criticism that by doing so, Ukraine has gained a significant advantage, but it was also forced to divide its forces and weaken them in some areas in Ukraine itself, which put them in a fairly difficult situation.
No, I would not agree with that criticism at all. That's what I meant when I said that they looked at the situation in the Pokrovsk direction and saw that they could take risks because the Russians could not exploit that. So, you no commander has enough resources to do everything, which is why you always want the initiative. You want the enemy reacting to what you do versus you reacting to what the enemy does. And this is what the Ukrainians saw was an opportunity to get the initiative by taking some risk in the east, because while it would suck to be a company commander or a sergeant defending Pokrovsk, the fact is the Russians are not going to be able to break through and advance deep. So that was a smart risk, a prudent risk for the Ukrainians to take so that they could marshal enough forces to achieve this uh, bridgehead that they have inside the Kursk Oblast. And you say, so what did they achieve with that? At the strategic level, they have created a dilemma for the Kremlin, who was already talking about negotiations, and that negotiations mean that we get to keep everything we already have. That was the start point. The lines where they are now. This is a different story now with Ukraine occupying part of Russia. So there's a dilemma for them at the strategic level, and then of course politically, it's at some point. I mean, Putin can't conceal that, and it changes the narrative that Russia is invincible, that there's no way Ukraine can win. This changes that. At the operational level, the Russians are now having to figure out, okay, where do we get the forces? They're the ones that are having to divide and distribute or reallocate resources to deal with this that they would much rather be using somewhere else. So it's a problem for them. And at the tactical level, um, I have been impressed that the Ukrainians were able to pull off this surprise, build up enough forces on the Russian border without being detected, or if they were detected, without being disrupted by the Russians, right on the Russian border. And this is highlighted that for me that the Russians still have not fixed their command structure, because you've got FSB responsible for the border, you've got general staff forces. These guys hate each other, and so um, it doesn't feel like there's a coherent C2 structure in place still.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. It's launching from January, it's completely free, and you can already sign up so that you receive the first edition. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed.